Hello, my name is Anne Beversdorf, and I'm going to be talking about Vedic astrology as it relates to Western astrology. I also have to warn you that I have a bad habit of bouncing my legs, so if you see my body bouncing up and down, it's this unconscious habit I have, and I apologize for it. So that taken care of. My background, I've been an astrologer since 1992, and so I'm in my 26th to 27th year of astrology right now, done, something like 20,000 charts over this period of time. And I use both Western and Vedic astrology. The Western astrology was the first thing I started learning, and I started learning basically what we would call evolutionary astrology. And then I started studying Vedic astrology in about 94 and maybe 93, I'm not quite sure. But at the time, Project Hindsight was studying Hellenistic and, well, it was Greek and Persian and Roman and Hebrew and all sorts of ancient astrologies. And I was attending a bunch of workshops, and it was fascinating. And it was Rob Hand and Rob Zoller and Robert Schmidt. All these guys were just brilliant scholars and translators and understanders of the old cultures. And what I realized, I've got so much earth in my chart. What I realized is that they didn't have enough information for me to be practical about. I couldn't use it. They would have part of a rule from one ancient wise person, and then the rule wouldn't be finished. And then they'd translate somebody else and they'd find another part of the same rule, and it took them quite a while to put it together to make it useful. Now we have a whole field of Hellenistic astrology. We didn't have it at the time. I started to realize that I had to have been alive in the period where Western and Indian astrology were coming together, and I could feel that lifetime. And I knew that I knew this stuff somehow, but I had to use what was practical. And so I went with Indian astrology rather than the Hellenistic astrology, but I'm still a Western astrologer. And that goes to kind of the beginning of what I want to talk about. Let's see, did I cover everything you wanted me to say? How long have I been doing this? Yeah, I'm an old lady. Okay. What I want to talk about is astrology in general. We are a language. All of you will know that when you find another astrologer, it's just a thrill to be able to speak the astrological language with somebody, because it is a language. And if you've been using astrology for a long time, you see the world in astrological terms. You see the trunks of trees as Saturns, and you see people who are skeletally thin as Saturn, and you see people who are rotund and jolly as Jupiter, and you just put these words to the world around you. But as a language, astrology has a lot of dialects. And even within Western astrology, we'll have the evolutionary astrology, we'll have traditional astrology, we have sun sign astrology, we have the Hellenistic astrology, and I haven't even begun to talk about all the kinds of dialects we have just in the Western system. And in the world system, we have Chinese astrology, we have Tibetan astrology, which is kind of a cross between Chinese and Indian. We have Indian astrology, Hindu, Vedic. Jyotish is the official name, means the science of light. And we've got Mayan astrology, and these are all different branches of the language. Some of them are so different, they're almost like Spanish and Portuguese. You don't just walk into a room of Spanish speakers and understand them if you're a Portuguese speaker. You have a heads up, but the Latinate languages are different from the Sanskrit and the Oriental, the Eastern languages. Okay. But when we are looking at astrology, we are using a language. And our job when we're talking to clients is to translate our language into English. Now, when you work with more than one system, there is a problem with getting just tangled. The Indian system and the Western system are different in a lot of technical ways, And I knew a guy once who actually, one of the differences between Western and Indian is that the Indian system uses the sidereal zodiac, which means if a planet is in a sky at night and you say it's in Aries, you will see the constellation of Aries where that planet is. The Western system has kind of divorced itself from the constellations. We're 24 degrees off. So only 6 degrees of the Western sign out of the 30 degrees, like between 24 and 30, 23 if you're old enough, only those 6 to 7 degrees will be in the same sign in the Indian system. So we're looking at a different definition of what the sky is. And I actually knew an astrologer once who combined the tropical zodiac and the progressed tropical zodiac and the tropical. So we had a natal, progressed, and transits in tropical. And then he added natal, progressed, and transits in sidereal and put them in a 6-wheel chart and swore that the numbers would line up in meaningful ways. And this made no logical sense to me, but he was getting meaning out of it. And I think the real issue is the sky. The sky itself is a hologram. And wherever we stand and we look at the sky, we don't necessarily, but people who didn't have electric lights in their houses and were staying up inside all night, they were sitting outside looking at the sky, and they understood it to be meaningful. And they interpreted that meaning in ways that meant a lot to them. Okay, so when we look at Western and Vedic astrology, for me, my approach is to keep the systems different. I mean, the rules are different, the planets are different, the degrees of the planets are different. And there are some techniques that bridge both systems. For example, if you use a graphic ephemeris, that's a geometrical thing. It doesn't matter. Okay, if I point to the sun on the first day of Aries in the tropical system, and I say that sun is in Aries, but an Indian will say, no, 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 that sun is at 22 degrees of, let's see, I always get time zones and zodiac back and forth mixed up. Let's see if you're, so it would be in the previous sign, it would be 22 degrees of the previous sign. So anyway, they're gonna say it's a lily and somebody else says a rose, but you're both pointing to the same flower. It's exactly the same flower in the exact same geometrical relationship with the other flowers, stars in the sky. So graphic ephemeris is just showing you the geometrical relationships between the planets. Therefore, it doesn't matter whether you're talking tropical or zodiac. A graphic ephemeris will work in both systems. You don't have to make any adjustments to it at all. Likewise, degree symbols, Sabian symbols, for example, they are likely to work in both systems. The degrees change, you know, you may be off half a degree or something, but the Sabian symbols are going to have a lot of meaning in both systems. So I am comfortable using those. Okay. When I read charts for clients, I'm always going back and forth from the Western system to the Vedic system. And this goes, the biggest difference between the two systems of astrology isn't anything about technique or interpretations or which zodiac you're using. The biggest difference is history, because the Indian system of astrology has been unbroken, although it has many branches. It's been an unbroken tradition for 4,000 to 8,000 years, maybe longer. It is an ancient tradition. There are ancient works that were written down in the 12th to 15th century, but they were verbal before that. And when I say verbal, I don't mean somebody remembered it and kind of translated what they remembered. What I mean is these children literally, I mean, some of my Indian astrologer teachers were taught from the time they could speak at all, from the time they were a year old. They were taught these rules of astrology. they were taught to memorize them. Instead of memorizing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, they were memorizing the rules of astrology, word for word for word. So these traditions are very solid and they're unbroken, but they are caught in an ancient time. So in ancient astrology in India, there will be a combination that will say, oh, you have a combination as a yoga. Yoga means a combination. That's literally what it means. You'll have a yoga that says, oh, this is a person who will own 10,000 elephants. Now, if you have a chart, and there are programs that will show you what all the yogas say, and you have a chart that says you will own 10,000 elephants, and you see this in your list of yogas, you say, well, this is the most absurd thing I've ever had. I don't want, and I never will have 10,000 elephants. This is just absurd. But what it means in modern terms is that you will be wealthy beyond belief. There's another pattern in Vedic astrology, which was generally said to be a prostitute. If you have this combination of planets in signs and houses, you'll be a prostitute. But in modern times, my teacher did a lot of studies of Oscar winners and Hollywood people, but Oscar winners in particular. And a huge proportion of those people have that pattern of being prostitutes. Well, what they're doing is they're selling their bodies. So we have to reinterpret. And it's not easy to throw out the old cultural rules. Now, we've got another problem with cultural rules, because in the Indian culture, that culture in modern day is very different than Western culture. So we've got to translate not only the time period of the history of Indian astrology, but also the cultural differences on a contiguous basis, where we're both in the same 2018, but their culture is very different than our culture. And I'll talk about that again a little later. By the way, I'm gonna break periodically and ask if there's anybody who would like to ask a question. And I don't know if I've covered anything to create that opportunity, but I will say if anybody would like to ask a question right now.
So, Anne,
say something.
Yes, I'm here. When reading both Vedic and just Western astrology, you're using both systems. Do you switch back and forth, or do you just do one reading completely one way and then later on do the other way, or just a combination?
It's back and forth. I usually start with one system, and it depends on the client. If it's an Eastern client, I often start with the Vedic system, and then I'll go to the Western system. Or for Western clients, I'll start with the Western system, and then I'll go to the Vedic. But anytime I see something, you know, one of the thumbnail rules of astrology is, if you see something once, it's like, oh, that's interesting. If you see something twice, better pay attention. If you see something 3 times, you know it's there. So if there's something important that's showing up in the Western chart, for example, I'll stop right there and look and see if I can find it in the Indian chart. And you can find it in a totally different way. You may find, say, a Pluto aspect in the Western chart, but you move to the Indian chart, and I use the traditional planets with the Indian chart. I don't see any reason to mix the systems in that way. I'm not using Pluto at all, but you can find the very same energy right there. Or one of the things that you hear quite often in Western astrology is, well, Jupiter was going through my second house. I should have made a lot of money. Well, Jupiter is going to offer hope. It's going to offer optimism, but it isn't necessarily going to offer anything real unless it's activated in the Indian chart. And so I will look and say, is Jupiter activated? And this is a little out of sequence, but one example of that is, I was talking to a client a number of years ago, and it was like, October or something. And I could see a pattern of Mars and Saturn on it was something like a Saturn-ruled fifth house with Mars in the fifth house, and Mars and Saturn in the sky were conjoining or aspecting that Mars and Saturn. And so my question is, ooh, this looks like an accident or a problem with one of her children. There was a Uranus involvement as well. But in the Indian system, you have divisional charts, which means they're kind of like harmonic charts, but one of them is going to be about your parents, another one's going to be about your career, another about your children. And so I got the chart for children, because in the Western, fifth house could be creativity, it could be a book you're writing, it could be your intimate friends, it could be investments that you're making. And so I wanted to see if it was children. So I looked at the children chart in the Indian system, and boy, the dasha system. Now, that's something in the Indian system. We have in ancient Western astrology Ferdaryas and time rulers, but they haven't been used for thousands of years. And in the Indian system, there are dasha systems, which are periods of time that are ruled by one of the planets, and that planet will then let other planets be the co-ruler for times during that. So at the time that this was happening, it was going to be in the first 10 days of March of the next year. So we're talking October, we're looking forward to March. We could see that first 10 days of March. And there were these aspects all over her fifth house. And at that time in the Indian system, she was running a Mars dasha with a Saturn subperiod. So that means Mars and Saturn are going to completely do what Mars and Saturn do. If she'd been running Jupiter Mercury during that period, it's like, I'm not so worried about it. But she was running Mars Saturn. At the same time, she was getting a Mars Saturn transit with a little bit of Uranus thrown in the Western system. So I was able to say that this is a period, and I'll get to, I didn't used to be able to say things like this. I was able to say that this is a period when your daughter may be in a serious accident. And she said, oh my God, she's going to her first Iditarod, which is the Alaskan dog sled race. And she's going to be practicing in the Alaskan dog sled race. So she was going off to Alaska the first 10 days of March when she had this difficult thing. Well, one of the things I discovered early in my practice of Indian astrology was the Vedic remedy system. And I did a lot of experimenting with that. In fact, I ended up writing a book. Okay, I wrote a book, Vedic Secrets to Happiness, and it's kind of like reverse engineered so that you don't have to know your Vedic chart. You can answer questions like, do you have problems with authority? I mean, there are bunches of questions that each of them apply to certain planets in your chart. You find out which planets are messy, and those are the remedies you do, and the remedies are included. And they're almost all free, or maybe $1 candle from the grocery store, but you know, it's not expensive. It's just, and it's weird as all get out. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all, but I've done this for like 23 years, and it's just amazing. So I told her, you need to do Mars and Saturn remedies. So she started doing Mars and Saturn remedies. On Saturday, she would feed dark crows. She would feed them dark colored food. And on that Saturday is the Saturn one. Mars is Tuesday, and on Tuesday, she gave red flowers to firefighters. So she was doing these things every week during the Iditarod. Her daughter called and said, you won't believe what happened to me, Mom. I was in the learner's course, and so I had a sled with 4 dogs, and everybody in line had a sled with 4 dogs, but somebody 2 sleds behind me lost control of her dogs. And the dogs ran over the sled in back of me, and all 8 dogs ran over my sled, and I was knocked off the sled and was sliding on the ice, and dogs and sleds were going everywhere. And when I stopped sliding, my face was an inch from the metal claw that grabs the ice to stop the sled. And I got up. I didn't have any broken bones. I didn't have any broken skin. I wasn't hurt. And nobody could believe it. And she said, everybody at the Iditarod's talking about that horrible accident where the girl just walked away. So she indeed had the accident, but the remedies stopped it. So that's one of the advantages you get from a really old system. You get systems that complement it, and it's a matter of understanding the energy patterns. Okay, and I want another thing, an analogy between the Western and the Indian systems, how one is new and the other is old. This is kind of a dated example, but I'm old, so. After World War II, Japan was bombed into oblivion, and they were never very good at making cars and stuff like that before, but afterwards they built from scratch, and they ended up building an automotive industry that ran us into the ground. I mean, our unbombed factories had been around for they'd been around for 50 years at that time, and they hadn't changed a bit. And they were still going by their very old patterns and their very old systems, and they couldn't keep up with the new because they were entrenched in the old. And the Japanese system turned us on our head. It took us probably about 30 years to begin to catch up with their car making facilities. And I see that as a comparison between the Western and Indian astrology. The Indian astrology has this deep knowledge and these techniques, but it's not very useful if you have a technique that says, half of everybody you know is going to be a prostitute. Well, in 19th century England, a third of all of the women were prostitutes. Another larger group was in household servants, and there was only like 25% that were married and comfortable in basically their husband's living. So it was perfectly logical to say a third of the women were prostitutes at that time. But now you look at that belief system that this pattern means prostitute, and you've got to say this pattern means something. What does it mean in modern terms? So those are some of the difference. Western astrology, of course, has been lost and found over and over and over and over. The last big rediscovery of Western astrology was in the late 19th century, and that was when Alan Leo came up with sun signs. Wow, what a concept. And so suddenly, astrology wasn't something that only really weird, obscure people knew about. Everybody who could read a newspaper would read about their sun sign. Now, that may not have been very useful, but at least it got the idea of astrology out there. And there is useful data in sun signs, not a lot in my opinion. The Indians don't pay attention to sun signs at all. But the point is, sun sign astrology became the new kind of astrology. And so people would study and learn all the things about what is Leo. Okay, all of this is about Leo. So you've got the sun in Leo, you're really like this. And you've got Venus in Leo, love and money are like this. And you've got Mars in Leo, your temper is like this. And so they would just take the planet and attach it to the sun sign definition and consider that in astrology. You can do a lot with that, but it's very incomplete. And there's an interesting book by Benton Bobrick. It's like Benton Bobrick. And he is not an astrologer, he's a historian. And he wrote a book on astrological history that is really fascinating. And he's talking about ancient astrology. I mean, we're talking about before the medieval period. Of course, the medieval period was another resurrection of astrology. But to any of you who are interested, you can see the technical depth of astrology in our past by reading his book and seeing how you can get extremely detailed predictive information, most of which we lost. We lost it in dribbles, we lost it in bulk, and we lost it in in the 19th century, when everybody just went to, what is the sun sign? That means everything. And you've got bunches of planets, so you're not just your sun. So I'm very enlightened, and I can tell you you're not just your sun in Leo or whatever it is. I'll tell you you're also a Venus and an ascendant and a moon and all of this other stuff, but you're not integrating. And so what we've got is a new system that hasn't put all the pieces together. Now we're grabbing old stuff. Do you realize when they were doing the Project Hindsight translations, the Corpus Hermeticum, which had been translated a number of times, starting with Marsilio Ficino in the Renaissance, when modern people were translating this, they simply left out all the astrology because, quote, astrology is dumb, nobody believes that, no point in translating it. They just left it out. So we got a book of philosophy that was very strongly based on astrology without any of the astrology. And so these translators were now pulling this material back into current time. And the Hellenistic astrology system is very robust. I don't use it because I didn't study all the details. Let's see, where do I go next? So we've talked about the history. Any questions? Okay.
Yes, I had a question.
Yeah.
What is where can the individuation process be seen in Vedic astrology?
This
or
is
is that even, a part?
It is a cultural difference. Vedic astrology, I believe, is perfectly capable of providing that kind of insight, but nobody has developed that. Because if you talk to Indian astrologers and you'll say, you'll talk about psychology or life purpose, or they look at you like you're crazy. Well, psychology, your moon is in a bad sign and is aspected by bad planets. You had a problem with your mother. That's psychology. I mean, that's it. There it is. Problems with your mother. What else do you want to know about psychology? And so they haven't developed that. Western, when you lose a lot of your your astrology, and you're still brilliant people and you're working with what you've got, you look around you to see what's available. And what was available in the 20th century was psychology and transpersonal psychology, which is spiritual growth and development. And so we started applying these to the astrology of the day. This kind of individuation process is not something that used to be available. This isn't just thrown out. We didn't get the concept of individuation until we got Uranus in the sky. The old planets, sun, moon, and the planets through Saturn are all visible to the naked eye. They all have to do with material factors because they are visible. They are, if not tangible, because they're too far away for us to touch, they are something seen. Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Chiron, and whatever else you want to include in the package, are not visible to the naked eye, and they very much have to do with transpersonal development. So what I like to do, because Western astrology has developed this individuation process and the transpersonal spiritual development, I rely on Western astrology for that. But then I'll look at Indian astrology for when the possibility of a time where this can happen will become available. So that's, does that address your question? Addresses it. Does that help you understand?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. It's a big, big issue. And I did a lot of readings. I've been in Mexico a number of times working with doctors and lawyers. So they're highly educated people. And when I first started doing this, I was reading their charts and I was looking what Uranus did this and Pluto did this, and wow, Uranus was on your sun or Pluto was squaring your sun, and oh, this must have been a really difficult period. And they look at me just totally blank. And I look back at them totally blank, because how can this not be a problem? And then I'd go down and I'd say, oh, well, and here, at this point, Saturn was on your sun. Oh, that was the worst time of my life. And this happened over and over and over. And what I came to realize is, in a culture where, okay, we live, I'm not going to say we for everybody in this room, but the Western civilizations live in a culture where we believe we have control over our life and destiny. This isn't a fact or fantasy statement. It is a cultural statement. You only know you have control over your destiny when you don't have repeated outside things slamming you. If you live in a culture like India, where you have these great stone buildings that are always dropping rocks, and it's very possible that you could walk down the street and a rock will fall off a building and kill you. And the government may decide that if your hair is a certain color, you're going to have to go to prison. You know, these are all things that we get really upset about because they shouldn't happen. But if you live someplace where these irrational to our mind things happened, then you don't have a sense that you're in control of everything. And so the Uranus, Neptune, Pluto things, those are our ability to transcend physical reality. They really are. They're transcending by philosophic and spiritual and thoughtful means. If it's perfectly possible that you're walking down the street and somebody will arrest you because they wanted to, and send you to prison because they can, and certainly in for example, the African-American culture here, that may be the case, and I haven't done enough charts of African-American poor people, but I would hazard a guess that they don't have the same kind of access to Uranus, Neptune, Pluto insights, because they're still dealing with the ultimate authority of Saturn. You do it because I said so. You don't agree? Sorry, you're going to jail. I mean, that's all there is to it. Your house is falling down, that's not my problem. It's just, it's a different world. And I'm very grateful to be in the culture I'm in, but I also am very aware that our idea that we can control, I had an argument with somebody, and I was talking about remedies, and he said, I don't want to hear about remedies. You're giving over your power to some remedy. You're saying the planet controls you. And these great Indian teachers made a point of choosing the worst possible time to start a project just to prove that it wouldn't stop them. And I'm going, there are energy systems out there. You can't say they are not there. If you try, if it's going to rain, you don't say, I'm not going to carry an umbrella because I'm giving power to the rain. It just doesn't make sense to me. We have gotten arrogant about we can control everything. And there's got to be, in my opinion, I'm obviously, this is philosophical and quasi-religious even, but in my opinion, we have to recognize that there are some things that are completely out of our control. And the Pluto pattern is when those things happen, you have to know how to surrender. And of course, my view of Pluto, I was so excited when NASA came out with that photograph, the Hubble photograph, that big heart on the side of Pluto. Do you remember that? Because I had been saying for the previous year that I really am beginning to think Pluto is a benefic. Now, I'm a Sun-Pluto conjunction, so that's a big thing for me to say. But what Pluto does is it says, you know, you're in a rut. There's this phrase that says, the difference between a rut and a grave is how deep do you dig it? And Pluto's saying, you know, you've dug your rut pretty deep. You've dug it so deep you can't see over the edge. So I want you to get out of it. So they start throwing things in your little rut and breaking all your favorite things, and you're furious, but you don't get out. But if you get out, you see what's coming your way. Well, in my little story, Pluto says, I can't get her out, but I've got a friend with a sewage truck, so I'll call them. And then you have to get out or you drown in sewage. So that's the way Pluto works. You get all sorts of hints and then you don't have any choice. But if you get out, the minute you do get out, a red carpet rolls out for you and it takes you someplace that you never imagined. I had Pluto squaring my sun, which was in the 6th house, when I became an astrologer. And the company I was working for was playing really nasty games. I'm not even going to go into them, but they were huge financial, well, I'm going to say they cut territory. I can't talk. They cut the territory in half, and then they cut the commissions in half. So they cut out 3/4 of my income and expected me to say, okay, that's fine, I'll go on. And so my teacher, my astrology teacher at the time, wouldn't listen to me, and he finally said, I said, why won't you even listen to me? You leave the room when I talk about this. He says, I'm just watching you play Pluto with him. It's like, oh, can't win this one. So I left. I left the company and became an astrologer. It's not what I expected to do, but that's the way Pluto gives us gifts. It takes something that we have gotten committed to by identity or habit or security. Habit, not so much. It's security and identity. This is how I make a living. This is who I am. And it says, this is not the right direction for you. You got to quit and go in another direction. And if you say, I get it, and go in another direction, the world opens up. I mean, the world opens up. I don't make as much money as I did, but 26 years, I make a living, I live in a nice house, and I'm a lot happier. So we learn from these situations if we give it a chance, but the learning is not about, I'm going to master Pluto. You don't. Pluto is a benefic that says, do this and you'll die. I sat next to Rob Hand at a conference just after 9/11, and he said, you know, it was so horrible for me because I have a client, or I had a client who worked in that building, and for the last 2 years, she's been telling me how much she hates her job. And I've been telling her she's got to leave that job or she'll die. And she did. You know, that's what lack of humility, lack of surrender can get you. It can get you killed. Now, Pluto doesn't usually kill people, but I mean, it was a shock for him. Okay. One of the things that I find interesting is the whole sun sign movement came up when Freud was developing his new ideas of psychology. And what we were seeing, I'm a librarian for the Alexandria iBase Astro Catalog project. And so I'm taking libraries from around the world that are astrological libraries. I got my master's in library science. And I'm entering them into the computer, so there is a database that's available. And you can email me. You'll have my address in a minute. I've got to sneeze. You'll have my address at the end of this. You can email me for more information about this. But one of the things that I notice as I'm entering this data is the change in language and the change in thought process between the 19th century and the 21st century. And I realized that the 19th century is when Freud first came out. And by the middle of the 20th century, one of the favorite buzzwords was complexes. I have a complex. Or she has a complex. She's just not working right. But you must be complex. And we had that kind of language. And then the Jungian stuff really started entering our consciousness again, the middle of the 20th century. But this is when we were applying this new knowledge to what we knew about sun signs. Then we had Charles Tart, Adler. We had Stan Groff and Rick Tarnas working at Esalen, using astrology in new ways too. And all of these are applying astrological insights to the new thoughts of the 20th century. And this is part of what developed this individuation evolutionary process. There was a time in the late 20th century when predictive astrology was considered wrong. I mean, it was considered morally wrong. Don't do that. You're telling people what's going to happen to them. And I can see why it's not a good idea. It would not have been a good idea to tell that mother that her daughter was going to be in a terrible accident if there was nothing she could do about it. I wouldn't have done that. But when you've got a deeper system, you've got the remedies as well. So the wrongness, Bobrick's book, Indian astrology, all show how powerful predictive astrology is, how precise it can be. And the wrongness had to do with our not having enough techniques to do it well. So for heaven's sakes, don't tell somebody this horrible thing is going to happen or this great thing is going to happen, plan on it, if you don't know your techniques well enough to make it happen. That's dangerous. You don't want to tell somebody, oh, you're going to make $1 million if you invest in something right now, so stick all your money in this. This is con scheme stuff. I think in Indian astrology you could probably do that. I don't know how. There was two directions. Which way am I going here? Okay, I was teaching, for a while I was teaching a class on easy predictive techniques from both Western and Vedic astrology. In Vedic astrology, you have an emphasis on house placements, dispositors. You don't have sun sign astrology at all. In fact, they don't see sun signs as personality indicators. Nobody's going to say, an Aries is impatient and they don't even look at that. Aries is here on the chart. The first question is, which house is Aries? Is it the first house? Is it the third house? Is it the fifth? Which house is it? If it's a good house, that means one thing. If it's not a good house, it means another thing. Where is Mars? Dispositorships are huge. They're really everything. So the ruler of Aries is Mars. Where is Mars? Is it in a sign it's happy with? Is it in a house it's happy with? And that's how you interpret a chart. The personality factors in Indian astrology are the nakshatras, which are the lunar mansions. And the moon, as it goes around the sky, goes through, in the Indian system, 27 different houses. And some of them, and they each have a different personality. And if you ask an Indian, what is your sign? They will give you their lunar nakshatra. They'll tell you the nakshatra the moon was in. And in fact, some people are named for their nakshatra. They're named Ashvin, or they're named Chandra, which means moon. Ashvin, my moon is in Ashvini. So the whole way of interpreting it is different. And then they also have something called the dasha system, not dosha, which is, your physical type, but dasha, which is a time system. And there are a number of different dasha systems, and that we don't need to worry about that now. But the dasha system is going to take the planets, the 7 points, Sun through Saturn, plus the North and South node. And they're going to take those and say, for this period of your life, depending on where your moon is when you're born, it's going to say there's 120 years in the most used dasha system. And it's going to say, when you're born, you're going to start someplace in this 120-year line, and you'll be ruled by the South Node. That'll be your birth ruling planet. And you'll be in that, if you're born at the very first day in that, you'll be in that for, I think it's 6 years. Anyways, it'd be 7. But if you were in Venus, there's 20 years altogether. And if you're in Saturn, there's 19 years. And, it's just, all of these things rule a different period of your life. And under that, you get all the other periods. So under Saturn, you get Sun, Saturn Sun, Saturn Moon, Saturn Venus, Saturn Mars, all of these different subsections. And so one of the things that I did with my students is they all had their chart. You can use your Western chart for this, it doesn't matter. and you see what planets are in conjunction in your chart. And then you look at your dasha list, and I gave them all their dasha system. And I said, okay, so you have Moon North Node conjunct in your chart. Then look in your chart. I'm just looking at the little message down there. Okay. So you look in your chart and you see which planets are conjunct, and you look at the dasha system and you see when you were running that dasha system. And I would say during that period of time, which could be a couple of months to a year and a half or 2 years, during that time, you were likely to have gotten married. And the whole class would go, oh my God. I said married or divorced. In the Indian system, they always say married. But in the Western system, it doesn't work. And the Indian astrologers, when they were first coming here in the 80s, they were telling people, oh, you got married here, or you got married there. And people were going, what? And when I was studying Indian astrology, I met with a number of astrologers, and they pointed to a period of my life, and they said, several different astrologers said, oh, you got married here. And it's like, what? And then I realized I had 3 proposals during that period. One was from a gay friend who thought I could marry him and get health insurance. And 2 were from a guy I was trying to break up with, and his answer to my wanting to break up with was to propose to me. So you could see why I didn't take these. When he said you got married, I didn't remember this right away. It wasn't a big deal. But in the Indian culture, you don't get to a discussion of marriage unless you've thought it through. The parents have decided it's time. We're going to make sure our children get married at this point. And of course, it's changing now, but there's still a lot of people who live this way. And so a marriage period in India means marriage. In the West, it can mean living together. It could mean getting a proposal that you turn down. It could mean getting a divorce, because what it really means is changing your relationship status. So, but it's a very effective predictive technique just to look at where you have conjunct planets and what dasha system. So you could have Moon Mars, or you could have Mars Moon. They're both going to offer you those opportunities. Of course, there's a lot more to predicting than just knowing that one thing, because there are a lot of people who don't even have conjunctions in their chart. So what are they going to do? But that's part of what you learn. The fate and free will question. In Indian astrology, the tradition has not developed the psychological and transpersonal and evolutionary approach to astrology. They are looking at planets from the sun through Saturn, which are very material and earthbound. They're not spiritual at all. I haven't used the other planets in my Indian chart because they don't rule anything. The rulerships of the old planets are very, very tightly conceived system. So you have Saturn ruling Capricorn and Aquarius, and you have Mars ruling Aries and Scorpio, and you have Jupiter ruling Pisces and Sagittarius, and the other planets don't fit into the system. I'm not the person to figure out if they could. I'm not saying they couldn't, but I can't see how they work. The system is so perfectly balanced. It's like a clock that runs with wheels and gears, and somebody says, oh, here's a new gear, it's a great gear, put it in the clock. It's like, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to put that extra gear into this clock because it works this way. So what you get with Indian astrology is you get real world events. You do get emotional and psychological events. For example, with the nodes, okay, with the nodes, we have in the Western tradition, the South node is the rut that you're stuck in, and the North node is the direction you need to move into. And in the Indian system, the interpretation of what's good and bad is almost opposite. The North node is what you don't understand, what you crave, and what you may be addicted to, or what you want, but it'll never satisfy you. And the South node is what you've already, the nodes are the dragon's head and the dragon's tail. When you cut off the head of the Rahu Ketu north-south node axis, the head has the brain and the mouth. You can put stuff in the mouth, but you never feel full because you don't have a tummy. And your analysis of the world is coming from the brain, not from the heart or the gut. The south node, you can't take anything new because the mouth is not there. But you have to learn how to utilize everything you've already taken in. You have to digest it. You have to process it. You have to feel it with your heart, with your gut, and you have to eliminate poop out, those things that aren't serving you. And so they say, spend time in the south node, spend time in understanding. Now, when I'm using both systems, what I realize is you've got to have a balance. You can't aim in one direction or the other direction. You have to balance it for your life to work. And so those are ways that I'm looking at the time now, those are ways where you combine these systems to make them work as a practicing astrologer. And let's see, if I have anything So what we get is history and contemporary. What we get is practical and physical, and psychological and transpersonal. And we can get them if we put the two systems together. And we've got about 6-7 minutes. So any questions?
Well, this is so fascinating. Thank you so much. Any questions from our audience?
I had a question if no one else does. I'm kind of wondering, how does the Vedic, how did you handle someone, say, born through the tumultuous time of the 1960s, since the Vedic system doesn't use the outer planets? How did they see that time period, and of course the subsequent Uranus-Pluto square?
Well, obviously, they're not looking at those particular patterns to determine the time system. What they don't understand, this is not a fair way to say it. What I find frustrating when I'm talking to an Indian astrologer is asking questions like that, because their response tends to be, it doesn't matter what time period you're born in, it matters what life you're born into. And that isn't a satisfying answer to me. So for that, I would go to the Western chart. I have a brother who was born in 65, where he had, he's got Mars, Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto in an exact opposition. It's a messy, messy chart, and he's done very well with it. But, and a funny thing that happened to him, who is very much a physical world person, he's a neurologist. And I couldn't even talk to him about astrology when he was in med school. He's 15 years younger than me. And several years later, I said, there was a time in med school when Pluto was squaring your sun Jupiter conjunct. And I said, that really must have been difficult. There was somebody with power in your environment who was stepping all over you, and you couldn't do anything about it. And he said, well, not really. It wasn't a bad time, but my advisor to the program wouldn't agree with me on anything. No matter what I suggested, I was wrong. And there was a research project I wanted to do, and I knew I couldn't tell him because he'd just say no. But one of my buddies, this advisor really liked. So I got my buddy to say to this guy, I was thinking about this idea. It seems like it'd be a good idea for research, but it'd be a horrible project to do. I wonder, somebody ought to do it, though. I wonder if you could get David to do it. And so the guy said, oh, great idea. And he gave it to my brother. I mean, he handled Pluto without even knowing how to handle Pluto. I mean, he just instinctively knew what to do. I can't say he's the most spiritually bright person I know, but he had that instinct to do that. So I don't know what the point of that story was, but the point is we don't need astrology. Some of my best clients, every time I do a reading for them, that I'll say, well, it looks like you're going to be doing this in this month. And they say, oh, yes, I already have a plan. You know, you're going to be teaching overseas. Oh, yes, I already have a teaching job in Denmark at that time. And I ask her, why do you talk to me? Because you already know what's going on in your life. And she said, I just want to know that I'm on the right track. And I'm sure many of you have run into the same thing when you tell somebody this and this and this, and oh yeah, that's exactly right. They're on the right track. And we can be on the right track. I'm not smart enough to do it without astrology, but my brother was smart in one way, so we can be. It's a glimpse into the machinations, the clockwork of the universe as a whole. And I don't think it matters what system you use, because you can get all the information. If I were studying Indian astrology without reference to Western astrology, if I'd never heard of Western astrology, but I grew up in the US in the 20th century and was studying Indian astrology, I'm sure I would figure out how to apply transpersonal psychology to it and spiritual and evolutionary growth to it. But I am lucky enough to have a system that already works with that, and I can use the two systems back and forth.
So, Anne, we're just winding down now. We've got about 3 minutes left. So, can you please answer the question, fate or free will?
It's both.
Uh-huh.
It's not an either or thing. There are some things that in Indian astrology they have, well, in Indian philosophy, they have many kinds of karma, only one of which is called fixed karma. That's the kind of karma that you can't change. And I'm sure there are things in each of our lives that is like, I can't change that. You know, perhaps our choice was we were born into this family or this city or this country or this time period. That was our choice. So that was a choice we made. But once we're in this body, we don't have that choice any longer. And if you're, you know, a 4 foot tall person, you're not going to be in the NBA, period. That's the end of the story. That's fixed. And there are other things in my chart. There are 24 ways at least to see whether a person is going to have children. 23 of them in mine say no. The other one says if you try real hard with technical help. So, you know, that's fixed karma. And it actually served me because I could say, oh, I don't have to worry about supporting a child. I can be an astrologer. But not all karma is fixed karma. Only a few kinds of karma are fixed karma. And if you know how to work with remedy systems, which is really about knowing how to work with the energy around you, which is the spiritual end of Indian astrology. It's working with the energy systems around you to harmonize with them. And so there are a few things that are fated, but most we've got a lot of choices about. And some of the choices have to do with the discipline of doing remedies.
Great. Thank you, Anne. Very fascinating. Okay, we have 1 minute left. Any final comments before we wind down? Okay, I'd like to thank you so much for this very interesting meeting, and good luck with your book, Vedic Secrets to Happiness, or Vedic Secrets to Happiness. And thank you for your work on the Alexander Project as well.
It's exciting, and it's freely available to anybody who wants it. The address is alexandriaibase.org.
Great.
So you can look.
I'll put that into the details, into the description of the video below. And would you all please thank Anne Beversdorf, everyone. Thank you, Anne. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Anne. That was fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.